Here's a small little military type test equipment box that I had picked up quite a few years ago. It's rather small. It's probably about 3 inches on one side, 4 inches on the other. It wasn't really complete. It had some hardware rolling around inside. As in the foreground there's a like an RF subassembly with no parts and just a lot of stuff rolling around inside the box itself. It looks like some form of antenna matching network. Does have a 50 microamp meter on the inside. I'll show that in a second. But it was not functional as it sat. So it's been sitting on this shelf for a while. So I figured what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the thing apart and I'm going to build a small field strength meter out of it. And similar to the drawing here, just a voltage doubler type RF detector. And inside the box there's already a 50 microamp meter. So we'll build this little project and see how it works out. Well, the inside of the box, like I mentioned before, is very stripped down. This is pretty much the way I got it at a Hamfest. It has a 50 microamp meter inside here, a small one. And internally there's just an empty plate here, if I can get it out. But the box itself is just virtually empty. BNC connector on one corner here. There was a BNC on the other corner, but that's since missing. That's on that RF subassembly I had before. But the nice thing about the box is it already had the 50 microamp meter, so this should go together quite well for a little RF field strength meter. Some of the main components of our RF field strength meter: the 50 microamp meter that was already part of the box, an antenna, a 50K pot, a couple of diodes, a resistor, and a couple capacitors, and that should be about it. More mechanical than electrical, but we'll start putting this together and see what we come up with. What I'm going to do is fabricate a small PC board to mount on the back of the BNC connector. That'll get all the RF components as close to the input connector as possible. So I'll just score and snap off a small piece of PC board and mount the components on that little piece of PC board, and then ultimately mount that on the back of the BNC connector. Here's a close-up of the small circuit board built up behind the BNC connector. Pretty simple. It's kind of like what is called Manhattan construction. There's a small PC board ground plane and then little squares of PC board material superglued down to the back plane for the isolated pads to solder to. So it's a real simple construction method. It's not a professional PC board, but for quickie prototyping and small projects it works pretty well. Just use little PC board islands that you can cut out of PC board material and then super glue it down to the ground plane for solder pads, and it works pretty well. And of course a little gray Rust-Oleum on the front panel before assembly, just make it look a little better. The final wiring is pretty straightforward. Per the schematic, it's nothing more than the back of the meter, the 50K pot, and an RCA connector for the output, just in case maybe you want to see the output or something. Again, the back panel wiring is really straightforward. There's not a whole heck of a lot to it. And the front panel is pretty simple too. You've got the RCA connector for an output, 50 microamp meter, and a gain control just to level the meter. Now it's interesting too, this guy will detect RF all the way up to over 900 megahertz using a signal generator. So that's interesting. You should be able to see the activity of a cell phone. This guy ends up being relatively sensitive. At 440 megahertz I can just start seeing Well, I can see a measurable meter movement at about 40 millivolts of RF at 440 megahertz. Well, here's the final product, my little RF field strength meter built into a little military case. Works pretty good. Ends up being nothing more than 50 microamp meter, diode detector inside, level meter, and there's a DC output after the RF diodes, just to, I don't know, you can probably plug an amplifier into that, see if there's any detected modulation on the signal. And of course, just a extendable antenna. The interesting thing is this guy with 1N60 germanium diodes as the detector diodes, this guy will detect with a signal generator. I can see RF detected all the way up to a little over 900 megahertz, which is rather interesting. You should be able to potentially see cell phone activity on this guy. It's quite sensitive. So there's my final little project box for my RF field strength meter. Rather fun little project, pretty simple, very few parts. The most unusual part was the small utility box that at one time was a commercial RF meter of some form or fashion. But a nice little project, and it'll be useful on the workbench over time.